Buenos días.
Good day.
Quiero comenzar agradeciendo a los responsables de la AEOS y a los
I'd like
responsables
to
de la Fundación
thank
BBVA
the parties
que me hayan
responsible from
invitado a
AEOS and
participar en
BBVA.
estas jornadas y
Thank
que
you
me
for having
hayan
invited me
brindado la
today.
oportunidad de
Thank you for
presentar
having
una
allowed
investigación
me
que
to address the
llevo
issue of a
realizando desde ya
presentation,
varios años,
which I have actually
centrada
been
en las
working on for years.
tendencias
I'm
actuales de
focusing on
programación musical.
current trends
Una
in
investigación que se
musical
enmarca dentro de
programming,
un proyecto
which is
nacional
part of a national
de I+D dentro del
program,
Ministerio
R&D,
de
within the
Economía,
ministry,
y que reside en la Universidad de La
and
Rioja y en la Fundación Juan
it
March, lo cual
sits
me ha
at
permitido
Rioja University and
plantearlo
the
en
Juan March
términos muy
Foundation, which
ambiciosos. Lo
allows
que
me to
quiero
be
contar
very,
aquí
very ambitious.
son algunos
What
resultados
I
del
want to
análisis
share
de
is some of the
aproximadamente
results of the
5.000
analysis
programas
of
de
some
conciertos celebrados
5,000
en distintas ciudades europeas en los
programs
últimos años.
performed in
Y mi
different
objetivo
European
era
cities over the past years.
tratar de trascender
My
el
idea
listado
was
de
to
los compositores más
try to
interpretados, algo
overcome
que
the list
consecuencia
of
vemos en la
most
prensa, que es una
frequently
información interesante,
represented
pero que me parece
musicians,
que
which of course is
necesitamos para
important, but
tomar decisiones
I
una
think that if
información
we're
más
going to
precisa.
take
Y por
decisions, we
tanto, lo
need
que yo
more
me planteaba en
specific
esta
information.
investigación
So
era
what we're
tratar de
thinking of
descubrir
here is
cuáles son
try
todos
to
los
discover
compositores que se interpretan,
who the,
en qué
the
proporción
composers are
suenan en
whose
nuestras
works are
salas,
interpreted, what
cómo se
proportion of works
combinan
are
los distintos
performed,
compositores dentro del
how
mismo
they
programa
are combined
y, en el
within the
fondo,
same
qué
program,
decisiones
and at the end of the
subyacen
day,
cuando un
what are
programador,
the
si
underlying
es que el programador que
reasons
toma la
why the
decisión, que no siempre es el
programmer, the
caso,
person who takes the
cuando se
decision,
configura un
why
programa.
is that decision
Y estas son,
taken
digamos, las
when
tres
designing a
cuestiones
program?
principales que voy a tratar
These
de,
are the
quizá no
three
contestar íntegramente, pero sí ofrecer alguna
three
información en la primera parte de mi
ideas that I'm going to
intervención
be keeping in
para
mind when I
posteriormente, en la
address
segunda
these
parte,
issues. And then in the second part of my address, I'm going to
plantearos
think out loud with
cómo
all of
nos
you
queremos posicionar ante este
how
escenario
we
que voy a
want to
describir, de
position
qué forma
ourselves
un
in the face of
programador
this scenario. So
se siente
how
interpelado
the
por
person
el
who takes
escenario
the
de las tendencias de
decision feels
programación
affected by
voy a
these
describir
trends,
y cómo uno
and
decide
how
posicionarse
one
ante eso.
decides to position oneself in the face of
Una
that.
reflexión
So it's thinking
casi
out loud,
inevitable, en mi
and it
opinión, si
has to be
quiere
like that. It has to
poder
be thought out loud.
distinguirse
If you need
de otras
to
instituciones.
differentiate yourself from other
comenzar
institutions, you
con
need
un
to do
lugar
this.
común,
So let me
que es
begin
la idea de que el concierto está en crisis. Esta
with a
creencia,
trite idea, which
todos
is
repetimos alegremente, de
concerts
forma
are
continuada,
undergoing a
tanto es así
difficult
que igual uno
moment.
cae en la
This is a
tentación de
critical
pensar que es verdad.
moment. We are
Resulta que está
in the
en
midst of a
crisis.
crisis. Well,
Puede ser
everybody
incluso
says
que
it
esté-
so
que esté
often,
en crisis.
so frequently that people are
En mi
beginning to
opinión,
think
casi
it's the
nunca, o muy
case.
pocas veces estas afirmaciones
Crisis?
se acompañan de
Well,
datos que nos permitan
You know, people say there's a crisis,
reflexionar
but
qué es
where's the
esta crisis,
data?
si es que está en
What
crisis
is
algo,
in,
con la excepción quizá de
crisis?
los datos
Why are we
existentes.
saying there's a crisis? With the
Esto
exception
lo tenemos
perhaps
bastante a mano.
of
Y con frecuencia,
spectators,
pues, uno
number of
mira este
spectators.
tipo
You look at this
datos.
kind of
Estos son
data,
es el anuario de la SGAE, que
and
seguro
this
que
is from the
conocéis, que nos
SGAE,
dice que en los
telling us
últimos,
that over the
en ese periodo de
past,
6 años,
in
hemos
this
perdido
6-year period,
aproximadamente
we've
un
lost
12%
approximately
de los
12%
asistentes, de los
of
espectadores
attendance,
a
of
conciertos,
spectators to
que no se
concerts.
relaciona quizá tanto
This
como
does
tendemos
not
a creer
perhaps
con
have
esta
that
reciente
much to do
crisis,
with
hemos
the
llamado,
recent
sino quizá una
crisis.
tendencia un poco más
Perhaps it
profunda, ¿no?
has
Porque
more
si
to
vemos
do with
este
something
periodo
deeper, because if
de
we
más de una
look
década,
at this
pues
10-year
sabemos ya en el
period,
2004,
we'll see that
cuando
already
surgió el
in
Kyoto también hay una
2004,
pérdida
already
aproximadamente
in
también del
2004,
12%.
there was
Son
a loss of
asistentes a
12%.
conciertos gratuitos,
So we're
son
talking about
asistentes a
free
conciertos de pago.
concerts and we're talking about
Lo que yo me he
paid
propuesto
for concerts.
no
So
es
my idea,
contestar si el
my
concierto está en
aim
crisis
is
y
not
cuáles son
to
las causas
respond to
de
the
esa
question
posible
of
crisis,
is there a
porque me llevaría
crisis
a un
and what are
análisis
the
que queda
causes, because that
claramente
would
fuera
lead me
del ámbito de mis
to an
competencias
analysis that I am not
implicaría hablar de
qualified to
cuestiones
perform. It would call
económicas,
for my addressing
sociológicas,
issues
culturales,
that are
tácticas de
sociological,
ocio, incluso
cultural,
demográficas. Más bien lo
demographics
que quiero
even.
centrarme es
No, so what
de
I
qué
want to
forma
do is address the issue of
el aspecto estrictamente
how
estético,
the
musical,
aesthetic,
relacionado con la
the
programación,
musical
puede
elements
estar
related to
siendo un
programming,
lastre para
is
la
this a
renovación de los
ballast
conciertos.
or not
Quiero poner
for
el
the
foco en
renewal
este
of concerts?
aspecto
This
particular y
is what
concreto,
I want to focus on specifically.
argumentando que quizá no
And I
está en
want to
nuestras manos parte
defend
de la
that
solución en la
perhaps
medida en
the
que depende de
solution
nosotros como
is not
programadores
only up to us.
decidir qué suena,
As
cómo suena
programmers, of course, we
en
decide
una sala de
what is performed in a
Entonces, lo que hice
concert
fue,
hall and
iniciar
how it
hace
sounds.
ya
So what I
algún
did was,
tiempo un análisis
some
sobre
time
las
ago,
tendencias
I
actuales de
began
programación
to perform an
a partir
analysis
de
of
los
programming
datos que
trends
que
on the
tenemos en
basis
Backtrack.
of the
Todos
information we
recordaréis
have in
hace la
Backtrack.
última edición de
You might
las
remember
jornadas de la AEOS
the
tuvimos
last
aquí
time
una
we
muy
met,
interesante
we had a
con
very
los fundadores de
interesting
Backtrack.
session, the
Yo he
founders of
analizado
Backtrack,
junto con un
and I
data scientist,
analyzed together with a data
una herramienta
scientist.
absolutamente
This is
fundamental
an
para este análisis,
essential,
sin el cual
essential
no hubiera
tool
podido hacerlo.
for this
He
analysis.
analizado
I would not
todos
have
los
been able to
conciertos
do
que
anything
aparecen
without it.
registrados en
So we've
Backtrack desde el
analyzed
2010
everything
hasta
that appears on
2015,
Backtrack
casi
from from 2010 to 2015, it's over 4,800 concerts. And what you see is a number of composers. So we could think that we're doing things fine. We're offering a very very broad scene there. Statistics, of course, there's 283 represented. There's a huge concentration in London. Backtrack, as you know, is based in London. New York, the second, and the 22 main cities take up 2/3 of the information. So Backtrack is representative, especially of what happens in the Anglo-Saxon world. But despite this limitation, I think that these are sufficiently robust data that will allow us to actually see what the trends are for programming purposes. So this huge amount of data allows us to begin to analyze, and what we see is something which initially is not surprising, but if we look at it with our magnifying glass, we see that it's terrible, actually, because only 33 composers of the over 1,900 represented and interpreted over a 6-year period take up more than half of the works represented, performed. So it's not that we love a group of composers. It's we practically only perform those composers. If we're looking at averages, we would say that in any concert, if you have, say, 3.9 works interpreted on the average, half are going to be works by those composers. Good friends, old friends of music lovers, here they are. But things get worse, because the top 10, as they say, that shortlist, and you know that's what you see in the media, represent 25% of the works performed. In every concert, one out of these 10 will be interpreted, and all programmers begin to think about their last season, and they're going to see whether their concerts abide or not along these lines. So then we can begin to think a little bit more, and we can think, well, who are these three composers? Well, if we look at this chronologically, which pretty well is looking at things aesthetically, we see that we are firmly anchored in the 19th century, a longish 19th century, right? They are all composers dating from the end of the 18th, beginning of the 20th centuries. And there's a couple who aren't. I mean, here's the Baroques, the Classicals, and 4 from the second half of the 20th century. These are that have classicist aesthetics. Adorno would definitely not consider them avant-gardist. So this is terrible. This is complicated. This is a paradox. We're living the 21st century, but we're living it with 19th century music. This is an anomaly. Never before, until the 20th century, had the music people heard music of the past. It was always music of the present. And another anomaly is that this happens in practically no other field of the arts. So we're talking about aesthetics, we're talking about canonization, we're talking about a sociological fact, how we consume culture, which would, of course, lead us to ponder upon how we're going to deal with the situation, which is anomalous, which sometimes, we don't grasp because it's part of our daily lives, but can, in fact, become a source of concern. So let's continue with our analysis. We see that there's a group there, a largish group of composers, less than 100 interpretations, and then there's a final group, 3/4 of the composers who are very, very occasionally performed. They're like testimonial. 3 or less times. This allows us to really stratify our analyses, and if I had time, I would love to devote the morning to explaining these facts, but I can't. I'm just going to look at a couple of other facets which will show us that we need to think and we need to analyze these issues. So we need to think about up to what point these programming trends can nuance local practices. Backtrack collects information regarding London and New York concerts. I wondered, who are the composers most frequently interpreted in London vis-a-vis New York? And we'll see that of these top 10, 7 are the same, and the other 3 are, well, pretty similar. If we look at the details, we'll see that some composers not particularly in the canon list appear in both Cage, Heinreich, but we continue to analyze, we see the list in detail, and we observe that some do not appear in New York, but do in London. And interestingly, these have to do, they are linked to British, Purcell, Argyle, Williams, Tippett, and the same goes for New York. Those differentiated composers are some of them, not all. Some have to do with the North American scoring tradition. And we can actually be more ambitious, and we can say, who are the most frequently interpreted? When? How do they combine? And we have another really interesting tool, and I would not be able to explain how it works. It was designed by a professor at Salamanca University. We analyzed coincidences in this chart. There's a visual representation as to how these coincidences actually happen. The diameter of the center represents the percentage of interpretations whereby proximity of the name represents a certain nearness, and the line that links the composers, or the thickness of the line, indicates the strength of that coincidence. The thicker, the more coincidence. And here, well, we could devote a lot of time to this, talking about this graph and so on, and I'm sure it would be very, very telling. But what we see here is the Russians, Tchaikovsky, Shostakovich, Rachmaninoff, Rimsky-Korsakov, Prokofiev, Mussorgsky. We see the Second School of Vienna, very solid, very, very robust. So if we say Schoenberg, well, there go Webern and Berg. And then the Czech, the 3 Czechs, of course. Scriabin, well, he is not linked to the Russians per se, but he's very close to the Romantics. Chopin, Schumann, Liszt, Schumann, Schubert, very close to the French. Debussy, Ravel, of course, Fauvet, Berlioz over here. And then we did not find couples. Vivaldi, Handel, always together. Verdi, Rossini. So it's a chart which would allow us, if we isolated the different networks, it would allow us the patterns of coincidence. In other words, what are the programming practices? And we could actually be more specific. Look at Beethoven, absolute number 1. Beethoven is there, always there. He is the most interpreted of all musicians. We're never bored. And he's often associated with Haydn, but not Mozart. Interesting, which in principle is odd. It happens with Nilsson and Berlioz. It happens with the Romantics. Here's Chopin, Schumann, Brahms, Mendelssohn. And this is interesting too, associated with 2 composers from the avant-garde, Chambert and Boulez. So we could play a different game. Here's Britain. Interesting and very telling as to what the British do, how they program. We have to learn from them, how they have very naturally eased their repertoire, their own musical heritage into the repertoire. So there's Britain, and it happens also with the group of English composers, Elgar, Macmillan, Williams, Purcell, very different aesthetics, although at the end of the day, not that distant. We know that Britain actually resurfaced Purcell's music, Maxwell Davis, and we find another series of colleagues of the times, Shostakovich. So we would say that we can continue to think about this analysis. It's a very, as I say, powerful tool. The more data it has, the more it will allow us to reveal, identify the programming elements that come to the surface. And thanks to this data analysis, there's three traits, if you will, that allow me to explain how, on the basis of this data, we would understand what the modus operandi is of your standard programmer. We would apparently tend to concentrate disproportionately, I repeat, in a tiny group of composers, and this might well be a problem, and we should think about solving it at some point. There is clear predominance, also stifling, of the Romantic period, with some exceptions, but those exceptions allow us only to go to the more canonical elements. I mean, we go to the Baroque, and that's Bach. Wonderful composer, doubtless, or other more classicists from the 20th century. And when we devise programs, the programmer, the interpreter also, well, we tend to abide by these two criteria, nationality and style. In other words, we are 100% foreseeable. Before we program, we know what we're going to program. Before we sign up for the season, we know what's coming. We're going to be hearing and listening to what we've been offering and hearing for the past whatever number of seasons. In the upcoming 5 minutes, what I would like to do is come up with a series of possible solutions. As a programmer at the Juan March, and I'm not saying that this is the only way of tackling this problem. I'm not even saying it's the best way of solving the problem, but I do believe that it is a possibility. As to the foundation, I'm not going to talk about it because it's not the time or place, but I would want to underscore the fact that this is something very interesting. It is a programming that is based on organizing not concerts, because the Juan March does not organize concerts. What we organize is cycles of concerts. It's a different concept, it's a different approach, and it allows us to create an itinerary. It allows us to propose a narrative to the listeners via the music, how the composers are selected and how the composers are organized within each program. So we're going to see 4 very quick examples. These are 4 cycles. Thomas Mann, one of them. Thomas Mann, how he, the writer, the most musical, I think, writer, how music affected his writing. Different programs that tackled this from. So let's see, Dr. Faustus. What we did was we introduced a dramatized reading of fragments of the longest musical novel of the 20th century, Dr. Faustus, and with those extracts of the 5 key moments in the novel were to be a prod for the listening of the works that were directed. So you have those pages where Andreas Libikun, who is the protagonist, the main character, goes to a conference, and in the conference, why only 2 movements in Opus 111 by Beethoven? That's a question. Well, after the speaker, according to Thomas Mann, because there were 2 movements for that reason, well, the sonata is performed at that point, and that kind of connection. And Wagner, a second example, is Chopin and posterity. So this cycle studied how Chopin, as we saw, one of our top 33, sometimes top 10, how he shaped writing, composition for piano of many other future composers. So we begin by looking at the past, seeing how there was a very unorthodox combination, and, well, some would say terrible, a prelude without fugue of the well-tempered harpsichord by Bach, and then the technique, the writing technique, which appears in that prelude. So the program is on video. You can download that if you want. It's actually fun. And then 4 programs, which are for Chopin, with Szymanowski, preludes, polonaise, mazurkas, or sonatas, which run smoothly in these 2 composers. And here we relate with Scriabin, the Russian Chopin, And here, with Paris Fin de Siècle, Fauguet and Debussy, it's a different aesthetic, very different. And finally, Polish virtuosos. Again, all of the programs try to tear down expectations, not only of the composers, but the order in which they appear. The third, again from last season, here, instead of playing with the idea of programming difficult to foresee composers or foreseeable ones, but who are not frequently programmed, well, we saw how music was actually presented on screen. We saw repertoires that were related to different moments of the day. There was a video creation projected in the background with a very slow dawn in slow-mo, and the repertoire had to do with the dawn, the beginning of the day, then midday, then afternoon, poetic, very poetical moments, and here Clair de Lune. So create the kind of a setting with its appropriate lighting. And the final example, very, very, very recent. We haven't actually completed it yet. Today is our fourth and final concert of synesthesias, listening to colors, seeing sounds, which aimed at ensuring that our listeners recover synesthesia, which some composers say or said have lived. So there's projections, Schischgraben. We rebuild the 12 colors that are associated to the 12 notes. That's 12 groups of composers, hues, and Ligeti we combine with Escher. We project also, we create those similarities. And from this point onwards, and this is the end of my address, the thought is, what can we do as programmers? What do we want as programmers? In this case, I like to talk about programmer as curator. We have a curator of exhibitions, an acknowledged curator. We all delegate in the curator. The curator gives us a new approach. Well, I think that as programmers, we need to become curators. We need to try and set forth new visions, new ways of recounting music within a setting of a three-way negotiation and with the conditioning elements that appear there as a summary. Thank you very much for your attention.